my YouTube friends. It's not Casey Neistat. It's me, your old buddy Magnum over at Magnum Videos. And welcome to our Thursday photography and videography show. Last week I talked about the exposure triangle, the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. And this week we're going to talk about one of those elements. And that element is the aperture. Now, during the intro to this video, you saw the words f-stop. The f-stop is something that gives a lot of new photographers a little bit of trouble, or maybe a lot of trouble, understanding exactly what it is and exactly how it works. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, so that by the time this video is over, you will know everything you need to know about the old f-stop. So, I thought about this quite a bit on how to best explain it, and I think if we use an analogy, it might make it simpler. Let's look at your eye. Your eye is very much like a camera lens. It has a pupil, it has an iris, and it has a retina. Now, the pupil is where the light comes in. The iris is what opens and constricts to control the amount of light. And the retina is like your film in your old film cameras or your sensor in your digital camera. But the thing about your eye is that it is always on auto mode. So let's consider that you go outside into a bright summer morning and your eye senses that it's very bright out here. So it closes the iris down to reduce the amount of light going into your eye through the pupil. And the pupil is the black circle in the center. That's just a hole. Conversely, if you go outside on a dark winter evening, your eye senses the low light situation. The iris expands, opening the pupil and allowing more light to enter. Your camera works in a very similar manner. So if we compare your pupil to the aperture in the camera, we know that bright light will allow you to close the aperture down, thus restricting the amount of light that enters. Low light works the opposite way, and you can open the aperture and let more light in, which brings us to the f-stop. Now this is where a lot of people get confused. The f-stop is nothing more than a number that indicates how wide the aperture is open. There's actually a lot of math involved in order to come up with these numbers originally, and if you'd like to dig a little deeper, there is a really good video by Dylan Bennett that explains exactly how those f-stop numbers were derived. I will try to remember to put a link down below for that video. It's very informative. But for our purposes and for your understanding of this, we don't need to get quite that involved. So, the main takeaway from this video is that the f-stop numbers are pretty much backwards from how they should logically be. In other words, a small f-stop number indicates a large aperture, and vice versa. The f-stop numbers go typically from 1 through 44. An f-stop of 1 is the largest aperture and lets in the most light. F-stop of 44 is the smallest and lets in the least amount of light. So if you go from an f-stop of 1 to 1.4, you're going down a stop. If you go from 1.4 to 1, you're going up a stop. Going up means you're making your aperture larger and your f-stop number smaller. Each time you go down a stop, you're cutting the amount of light that enters the camera in half. Going up a stop doubles the amount of light that enters the camera. So if you go from a f4 to an f8, it means you're cutting the amount of light in half. If you go from an f5.6 to an f4, it means you're doubling the amount of light that goes in. Each time you move one step in either direction, you either double or half the amount of light. So let's take a look at some sample photos that I shot specifically for this video, and you'll see what happens to the exposure when you change the f-stop. Keep in mind that each of these photos, the ISO was set at 1600 and the shutter speed was 1/50th. The only change in the photos was the aperture or the f-stop. So let's take a look at those now. Now let's take a look at one more photo, which is still at the f/22 aperture, but I have slowed the shutter down so that instead of 1/50th of a second, it's only 1/4 of a second. It's a longer exposure because we have a narrow aperture and we need more light to brighten it up. So here's that photo, and I think you'll see that it's very similar to the very first photo in this series. One final note on f-stop or aperture is I need to mention depth of field. Now, I will do a whole video on depth of field later, but I wanted to mention it in this video just to get you familiar with it and give you an understanding of how depth of field relates to f-stop. If you have a wide aperture, like a low number f-stop, your depth of field is going to be very narrow. In other words, if you're focused on something in the center of your range of your shot, the things that are going to be in focus, as well as that center point, in front of the camera, in front of that point and behind that point, is a very narrow range. If you have a very narrow aperture, like a higher f-stop, like a f/16 or 22, you're going to expand your depth of field so that when you focus on the center object in the center of your range of distance, you're going to have much more in focus between that object and the camera lens, and much more in focus from that object away from the camera lens. So there are times when you will want to use a very narrow aperture, like if you're doing a landscape. So you can use a narrow aperture, but remember that you have to slow down your shutter to let more light in. I'll do a whole video on depth of field in the future, so I just wanted to point that out to you. And I think that's it. If you've got any questions, please leave them down below. If you have any comments, leave them too. Thank you to all my subscribers. I appreciate that very much. I appreciate all the new subscribers that are subscribing. I appreciate all the likes and the shares, and I even appreciate the dislikes because those help to move you up higher in the rankings too. So, and I'll probably do a video on that as well. Anyway, I think that's it for now. So until I speak with you again, and even after that, you stay focused.